I'm man enough to admit it, I never wanted kids. Took me a long time to realize that about myself. Too long, and now I'm in a bit of a bind, because a few weeks ago my wife gave birth. I thought I'd always wanted children. Jess and I used to talk about having kids constantly, even before we got married. Took us 15 years to conceive. 15 long years of endless doctors' meetings, negative pregnancy tests, miscarriages, and just about everything else you can think of, including one particularly traumatic stillbirth that came after the nursery was painted, and names were picked out. Long enough after that the little bugger still needed the delivery room to be retrieved. Yeah, it was a rough decade and a half, the kind of rough that means giving up, and admitting it was all for nothing becomes a potentially PTSD-inducing turn of events in and of itself. 15 years is a long, long time, and we weren't getting those years back. By that point, if I'd won the argument, if we'd turned away from Vermis Regina, neither of us would have got what we want. After 15 years, this war was either ending with a baby in our home, or it was ending Jess. There couldn't really be a middle ground after what we'd put ourselves through. I kept telling myself it was worth it though, because we wanted kids. That's all we'd ever wanted, or so I thought. Turns out I was only half right. Wasn't until she finally got pregnant that I learned a hard truth about myself. I didn't want kids, it turned out. I just wanted Jess. Wanted her in the wholesome grow old on the porch together kind of way. The pitter-patter of little Grahams running around was part of the package deal. She needed a future with them in it just like I needed one with her. We both knew our reasons for being on this rock. Both had crystal clear ideas of the futures we wanted, and we'd both do anything to get them. I need you to know that about us before anything else. It'll explain a lot. It's been over a year since I first heard the name Vermis Regina. That's a lot of months of web searches with no results, countless hours of fruitless research, and, importantly, almost 14 months of not contacting the authorities, or even either of our families, when I knew I really should have done. That's why it's so vital you understand just how passionate I am. I was, about making Jess happy, and how devoted she was to the ascension to motherhood, an ascension her singular underdeveloped and cyst-ridden ovary had forever denied her. Or rather, the claim to motherhood she'd been denied until Vermis Regina entered our lives. To start from the start then, Vermis Regina. At first we thought they were the answer to our prayers, a small miracle we'd endured more than enough disappointment to earn. After years of trying everything from acupuncture to IVF, Jess and I had nearly given up on the idea of having a child. We'd even started having conversations about using what remained of our savings on a new house instead of another round of treatment. I'd obviously started to consider the possibility that kids weren't in our future long before Jess. However, I'd stupidly allowed myself to believe the counseling and grief therapy had been working for her too. She hadn't been crying nearly as often during the 5 or 6 months in the run-up to the last night of normalcy we had. She'd even been open to discussions about adopting or fostering for the first time, something she'd always been too far in denial to respond to with anything other than rage. They were so close to moving forward with our life, so damn close. I remember the night clearly. Jess came running into the living room, waving a leaflet in my face, babbling at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It was a routine I'd more than gotten used to by that point. Vermis Regina were far from the first company peddling a revolutionary yet experimental new fertility treatment Jess had unearthed. We'd even gone as far as Romania for one, so I was no stranger to suspending my doubts and keeping my skepticism well away from my lips. I know now that's because I didn't actually care whether they succeeded or not. I just wanted Jess to be happy. If visiting quacks and medical charlatans for the rest of my days was what it took to have that porch and rocking chair dream, so be it. That being said, I was skeptical of this particular offer. There was a bit of an argument that night. Well, a lot of an argument. We had already spent so much money on expensive procedures that had yielded no results, and as I said, I genuinely felt that Jess was on the verge of turning a corner and channeling her need to offer motherly affection into a path with less resistance. I don't have to spell out for you who won that little spat. Jess was beyond insistent, especially since the treatment was being offered completely free of charge. I know what you're thinking. Free treatment? Big red flag. That's what I told her, but she informed me through very gritted teeth that one of our many doctors had passed on our information to Vermis Regina and they'd contacted us directly. I made it very clear how litigious I wanted to get about this breach of medical trust from whichever provider had spilled our very private beans, but Jess made it clear that if I did, she'd be getting very litigious about the future of our marriage. To cut a long screaming match short, we were in an office at a Vermis Regina clinic the following Sunday. Jess hadn't been lying. The treatment at the small but surprisingly state-of-the-art clinic would be entirely free of charge. One of those we need more confirmed successes before we can start offering this for money, so you're actually doing us a favor type cons. The only catch was that we would have to agree to use Vermis Regina doctors and stay as inpatients at the research clinic until the birth. The doctor informed us that such was the importance of the treatment that we'd be fully financed during this time, and the level of compensation would far exceed either of our salaries. I was hesitant about these terms for many reasons, mainly because they were obviously far too good to come without a massive hidden catch. But Jess was convinced that taking a chance on Vermis Regina was a small risk for the payoff of a possibility of finally becoming parents. In the end, I reluctantly agreed to proceed, and we'd moved into the clinic the following week, with Jess undergoing the treatment 2 days later. As for exactly what the fertilization treatment entailed, I still don't know. None of the nurses or doctors have told me anything about the procedure, citing patient confidentiality. It's an excuse I've got used to hearing about far too many things this past year, to be honest. It's only since the birth that I became fully aware of it, but the staff here do their absolute best to ignore my existence unless I directly interfere with them, and even then the interactions are disdainful on their part, bordering on, I noticed, worryingly too late, outright hostile. Jess still hasn't told me what happened in that room. I do know they never asked for a sperm sample from me, or any genetic information of mine to pass on, something I kept bringing up for a good few weeks before Jess told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to shut the hell up and stop questioning our good fortune. She wasn't right from the day of the treatment, until finding out the fertilization had stuck though. I noticed a lot of things she did her best to hide. Her cry in the shower, the cuts on her legs, the multiple pairs of bloodied underwear stuffed at the bottom of the hamper. I kept quiet about all of it. She was suffering for what she wanted, and all I wanted was her, so I was willing to suffer too. In hindsight, suffering in silence for the woman I love was the most harmful thing I ever did to her. As it was, my worries about the house and wives were thrown out the window. When we got the news, Jess and I were over the moon, and then we found out she was pregnant. After 15 years, and many more thousands of dollars, it felt like nothing short of a small miracle. Definitely enough of an emotional high to make me put my doubts aside for several months, and willfully ignore the many signs something was amiss. We spent hours poring over baby name books, and discussing what kind of parents we wanted to be. However, our excitement quickly turned to worry, even for Jess, when the quote-unquote morning sickness kicked in. We'd been expecting it, as our near success 10 years prior meant we weren't in totally unfamiliar territory with pregnancy, and how Jess's body handled it. This time the morning sickness wasn't just a little bit of nausea though, nor was it the intense but brief thunder chunders that took her last time. It was full-blown vomiting that lasted for hours on end, sometimes long into the night. I remember holding her hair back as she retched into the toilet until the bowl was filled with little but phlegmy bile and brown blood, feeling as helpless and scared as Jess looked. The Vermis Regina midwives and doctors, however, were unperturbed. They met every one of our requests for treatment. We tried everything to alleviate her symptoms: ginger tea, crackers, even prescription medication, but nothing seemed to work. All were obliged with a smile from the clinic staff, but never was there any worry about Jess's health or the state of the pregnancy. Jess was losing weight and went for several days without eating at one point. We'd both been on cloud 9 when we saw that little plus on the pea stick Vermis Regina provided, but even Jess had started to worry that something was seriously wrong after a week or two of the intense sickness and worryingly unintense response to it from our carers. Little did we know that the worst was yet to come. The morning sickness was one thing, but still at least within the realms of things that happen to people when they're pregnant. Even at the extremes of it had me locked in a state of paranoia. The night terrors, though, The night terrors were when I really started to cotton on that our situation might be incredibly messed up. They started a couple of months into the treatment. Jess would wake up after screaming for hours, shaking, and drenched in a cold sweat. That wasn't the worst part of it. The worst part was when she'd look down and realized she'd been scratching at her stomach in her sleep. Not scratching like she was trying to get an itch, either. Scratching in the way that meant her fingertips left sticky red prints round her mouth. When she clapped her hands to it and wailed upon waking, I never had to ask what the nightmares were about. What she'd scream in her while my attempts at waking her or stopping her clawing hands failed gave me all the details I could stomach. Bodies by the billions, small, furry, scratching over each other in an endless sea of writhing hairy flesh, a sea Jess spent night after night dreaming she was drowning in. At least Vermis Regina took the night terrors a little more seriously than they did the sickness. They arranged for Jess to have in-house psychotherapy immediately after her first night of sleep-induced self-mutilation. I didn't complain, as it definitely helped. Whatever they were talking about in those sessions, I reasoned it was working. She'd be docile and tranquil for hours after, and even the sickness that dominated most of her waking hours didn't seem to bother her as much. Yeah, this should have been a massive warning sign for me to get the hell out of there with her. I'm not going to spend even more of my time justifying why I was too stupid to do that. If you don't have any reason to be suspicious, you really don't question why both your wife and her doctors insist you shouldn't be present at any examinations. Excuses like patient confidentiality and hell would you respect my privacy. Graham fly much straighter. To my credit too, I was beyond exhausted. I was up with Jess night and day doing the basic care I'm sure orderlies and nurses would provide at any normal hospital. For months, the times Jess was whisked away from some kind of clandestine checkup were literally the only hours of sleep I had. To say I wasn't incentivized to be curious about why the father of the baby shouldn't be present for any scans or updates on the development of their unborn child is an understatement. Then everything changed. One night was all it took. About 2 months before the birth, I was fully aware I'd stumbled into a nightmare. After that, way too late to do anything about it. It was the first night in a week Jess had slept for more than a few hours without the hellish fever dream consuming her. I knew something was wrong straight away because when I was woken by the sounds of her frantic, tortured yells, they weren't coming from the damp, sweat-drenched spot in the bed next to me. They were coming from the bathroom. She'd locked herself in, crying and screaming, and I had no idea what to do. My best idea was to hammer in the door for a solid hour, yelling her name over and over again, which, despite being the worst plan imaginable, seemed to work. I still can't forget the sight of her, standing there in that far too pristine bathroom, shivering from both sobs and lost hemoglobin. Her face, how it was pallid and yellowish. Her usually voluminous hair clung to her moist base in greasy, sweaty strands. I remember the redness between her legs, the drops of it leading to the toilet bowl. The trail they left for my eyes to follow burned forever into the dark places my mind can wander if left unchecked. I remember looking into the bowl. I remember hearing my own startled yelling like it was coming from half a world away, from someone else's lips. I don't remember much after that, not of that night, at least. It's happened many times since though, but unfortunately Jess was too far along with her quote-unquote psychotherapy sessions to be as alarmed about it as she should have done. The first time it happened was probably the last time I looked Jess in the eye and saw the love of my life as I knew her staring back. They had her after that, I think. She went along with their spiel that this was all normal and natural. I wasn't buying it though, even before the birth. There was no way they could spin it. Human piss isn't supposed to be filled with clumps of clotted animal fur. It wasn't just the fur itself that was a sign of how messed up our situation actually was though. Jess's response to it after the first time, or rather lack of, was another clue. I'd still get flashes of the Jess I knew, but they were few and far between. While she'd spend the days ignoring me and muttering while occupied with digging out clumps of matted non-human hair from her intimate areas during the day, at night she'd have flashes of lucidity, panicked, pain lucidity, but lucidity all the same. It was during the last few weeks of the pregnancy that things started getting really screwed up. The first time it happened I was already awake and in the process of trying to save Jess's scarred and bleeding belly from another self-inflicted mauling. Without warning, she sat bolt upright and clutched her stomach. "The baby," she gasped. "It's kicking, but it's not. It's not right." I didn't know what she meant at first, but then I saw the look of panic and distress on her face. It was refreshing in a twisted way. It was the most human look I'd seen on her face in days. I didn't have to pry about what she meant either. Her belly was distended and writhing, the abnormally fast-paced and volatile movements within stretching and stressing the red rawness left by Jess's sleeping self. I'd only ever seen a baby kicking in that belly once before, a decade ago, but I'd replayed the memory so much it was ingrained in the inside of my eyelids. The kicking from Jess's second pregnancy was nothing like her first, and I hope for the sake of pregnant people everywhere, it's nothing like theirs either. I put my hand on her stomach and felt it too, a frenzied, scratchy movement that was unlike any baby kick I had ever felt before. It was almost like something was trying to claw its way out from the inside. Jess was breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. "Graham, it's not human," she whispered. "It's something else. Something terrible. Tell them to get it out of me. Please, Graham, get it out of me. Use your hands if you have to. Get it out of me, Graham." I had to wrench my wrists from her grasp as she forced them up against the writhing bulge protruding from her waist. Despite myself, I tried to calm her down, telling her that it was just a normal part of pregnancy. I lied to her, basically. Lied because my memory of how badly she wanted to hold a child of her own in her arms overrode all evidence. Our current predicament would not have that outcome. Lied because I was terrified of looking her in the eye if she lost this child too, because I couldn't see how to salvage our marriage if she ended up getting a termination because of advice I'd given her. Even if in the moment she agreed with the decision, I knew I was too much of a coward to entrust that time wouldn't change her perspective or fester resentment. Worst of all, I lied because, when it boiled down to it, I was willing to do anything to safeguard those dreams of rocking chairs, and I knew, or at least, I foolishly believed in my state of sleep-deprived poor judgment, that we had to get to the Vermis Regina finish line for that to happen. Of course, the kicking of unnaturally thin limbs pushing themselves 6, 7, 8 inches out of Jess's belly didn't trouble the Vermis Regina doctors, who arrived once I pulled the bedside alarm cord. They told us that everything was fine, that some babies just kicked more than others. Jess and I united in our assertion that this was BS. For the first time in months, it felt like she was with me again. Of course, the camaraderie lasted about as long as it took them to arrange her an emergency psychotherapy session. Weird thing though, none of the sessions seemed to help with her nocturnal terrors. Her nightmares got much worse. She would wake up nearly a dozen times each night in a cold sweat, screaming about endless oceans of furry bodies, writhing masses of worming tails, and uncountable sets of gnashing yellow teeth. And all the while, I could feel the scratchy kicks of the thing inside her, growing stronger with each passing rotation of the earth. As arrival day approached, during that last week I lost my mind. The situation became too much, even for me with my porch retirement life goal as an anchor. I decided to yank the assistance cord and not stop until the Vermis Regina doctors gave me some answers. I screamed at the 2 burly slabs of meat in white coats when they arrived, demanded to know more about the treatment they had used to get Jess pregnant, threatening all kinds of harm, self-inflicted and otherwise, unless they told me what the hell was in my wife's belly. However, instead of the usual defensive evasive non-answers, my questions were met with a rock-solid weight connecting with my face. The mountain of muscle that hit me crouched down to the floor he'd put me on, speaking very slowly and plainly so his message didn't get misconstrued. To my shock, the doctor made it very clear that they could induce a miscarriage if I continued to ask too many questions. I remember the color and warmth draining from my face, my pulse skipping several beats. For a few moments the doctor and I stared each other down, the silence broken only by the muttering of Jess removing clumps of bloodied fur from herself in the bathroom. They had me, and he knew it. Vermis Regina were smart. They clearly hadn't ignored me at all. They knew exactly which button to press to get my compliance. There was no way I'd let myself be responsible for things ending this close to the due date. This was Jess's last chance at true happiness, to find the fulfillment in her own life that she brought into mine on the day we met. They knew threatening to kill me wouldn't matter to me. Threatening to kill Jess's happiness though, that's a different story. As terrified as I was of what cost that happiness came at, with that kind of blackmail leverage, there's little they couldn't have had me do. I knew in my heart Jess would rather die now than grow old without being a mother. I selfishly coveted our companionship too much to be the reason she faced and prolonged unsatisfied life with me instead of a short but determined one doing everything in her power to live her purpose. I didn't have to suffer the indignity of my failure for long though. Barely 10 minutes after the quote-unquote doctor broke my nose for asking too many questions and delivered the terms for my child's safe arrival on Earth, Jess went into labor. Amazingly, our benefactors at Vermis Regina allowed me to be present for the birth, all 96 hours of it. I'll spare you a blow-by-blow account because, in all honesty, my mind has blocked out most of it. What I can remember are just flashes, just enough for my mind to be 100% sure that the memories it's hiding from me are hidden for my own good. I don't have to remember it in full to know that it was the most horrifying thing I have ever witnessed. A small army of nurses, midwives, surgeons, and general orderlies were in attendance. I can still hear their chanting when I try to drift off to sleep. An endless drone of almost words, a migraine-inducing throaty hymnal that undercut Jess's agonized guttural howls for every single hour of the near 96 of them I spent strapped to the chair. They wouldn't let me out of the chair. I was half-starved and dehydrated to the point of being on death's door when the baby finally came, but they never loosened the straps. They never let me out of the chair. Didn't matter how much of my time in the candlelight I spent thrashing and writhing against the thick leather wrist and ankle belts like a half-rabid ghoul. They never let me out of the chair. Everyone had their place and role in the arrival, myself included. The chair was where I needed to be, never out of the chair. I'm amazed I still had the energy to scream. By the end of the 4th day, I did though. It nearly finished me off, but I still managed to bellow so loudly the doctor's perpetual litany of unpronounceable eldritch blasphemy faltered a little. The chair was bolted to the floor opposite the bed. I'd managed to catch a brief glimpse of Jess when they'd strapped me in during the first hour, her legs up high in obstetric stirrups, her naked form quivering and trembling on silk sheets, a consistent stream of bodily fluids viscous, with non-human hair oozing from the dilated opening south of her distended bump. However, shortly after our arrival she'd been closed off from my view by the Circle Mantra reeling medical staff, so I'd spent most of the 4 days staring at the backs of their hooded heads. I don't know what I'd expected to see Jess cradling in her arms when the circle finally parted and I was allowed to look upon my wife again. Whatever I'd imagined it would be definitely wasn't anywhere near as bad as what I actually saw. What I could still see right up until this morning when one of the nurses had a change of heart and decided to leave this organization or cult or movement or whatever the hell Vermis Regina is, taking me with them and dumping me unceremoniously outside an Ur. When I first saw her in her postpartum state, Jess was, in all but one detail, the picture-perfect paragon of freshly acquired motherhood. All the pain of the last 4 days had gone from her face. It had been replaced only by a glowing warmth as she gazed down at the new life cradled in her bosom, the wet, slick, furry thing suckling at her breast with its worm-like tail coiled round her arm. I actually managed to stop screaming, sobbing, and spitting venomous curses at our captors. No, at only my captors now. For a moment, that moment only came because I puked. Hair feeding from my wife's breasts, umbilical cord still connecting to the shadowy gore-crusted wound between her stirrup legs, was a rat. A mangy, beady-eyed, foaming-mouthed rat the size of a human toddler. My yelling didn't stop when one of the chanting doctors cut the cord. It didn't stop when I saw Jess, a tired happiness in her eyes, bend forward to begin licking her own amniotic fluid from her new child's fur. No, I stopped screaming only at a very specific point. It was when I passed out from blood loss, which came way too far into the experience of my wife's newborn rat child slathering across and off the bed, skittering toward the chair and gnawing through my left ankle. That was a few weeks ago. I've lost one leg up to the thigh, the other to the shin, an entire arm, and the ability to have more children in the time since. Jess gleefully cooed her affection and approval while the rat consumed them all. The worst part is that I'd spent the entire time pleading with Jess, asking her both to let me go and to kill me at various points. She just smiled this vacant smile, and with my dried blood still caked round her areola, sleeping rat child in her lap, would say stuff like, "You're such a good father, Graham," or "Every family has its ups and downs. I'm only still alive because one of the nurses got cold feet. At least, I'm guessing that's what happened. Someone got me out of there, and that's the only plausible explanation I have. They came to me one night while Jess and that thing were sleeping, ripped the nutrient fluid IV drip from my arm, and unbuckled me from the chair before I really knew what was happening, and by the time I came back round properly it was weeks later and I was in a normal hospital. The cops surprisingly believe most of my story. Obviously, Jess had a job, we have friends and family. We'd informed our people we'd be going away and wouldn't be in contact, but not for anywhere near as long as we were actually gone. Jess and I both had been long since reported missing, so the police were open to pretty much everything. Everything, that is, except the truth of it, the most important truth, the child itself, that rat that consumed my future, and the cult that put it in my wife. They're going to search for Jess and are treating it as a cartel-related kidnapping. Their assessment is that Jess and I had been unfortunate enough to head south of the border and be at the wrong clinic at the wrong time. Jess was, by their most informed guess, taken as payment for a doctor's debt with men of ill repute, and my injuries were a brutality inflicted on me when I tried to stop them. Tale as old as time, they said, ignoring the fact that I'm pretty sure this incredibly stereotyped tale as old as time has never actually happened to anyone else either. Does the fact that both our passports were still in our apartment when the police searched it matter? Of course it doesn't. The parts of my account which actually matter they believe I have invented as some kind of post-traumatic hallucination, including the company Vermis Regina and the clinic. I know the truth though. They can search for Jess all they want. They'll never find her, here or south of the border. Jess doesn't want to be found. Jess isn't missing. She's more found than she ever was during our marriage. She's found her purpose now, and I gave her the happiness I always promised her that I one day would throughout our 15 years of trying to have kids. All it cost me was most of my limbs, my dreams, and her. Honestly, having kids was the worst decision I ever made.